I've got 10 minutes and I just wanted to quickly go through two projects that I've got one finished and one up and running, hopefully, in the Department of Anesthesia here. Unfortunately, I'm going to go in the opposite order of what you guys are doing. So we're actually going to start with the STPA project, and then we'll go and chat about CAST. So first, so this is the paper that this is all written in. So if you guys want more details on this project, I highly recommend going to our paper for that. But the first thing that I want to say is I loved your optimism, Nancy, by saying that 99.8% of medication administrations go correctly. I'm totally going to burst that bubble and say that what we found, at least in the operating room, is that up to 5 to 10% of medication administrations have some type of medication error, which is a reasonably shockingly high number. That, when you look at the number of medications that we give during a case, translates to approximately a third of all anesthetics. So a third of all patients in our ORs will have some type of medication error. Doesn't necessarily mean that they take any harm from it, but that medication error, that hazard is there. And part of this has to do with the fact that when you're looking at the way that we give medications in the operating room, it's very different from the way that we give medications on the hospital floors, right? A lot of the checks and systems that they have in place, we completely override, because in the operating room, as the anesthesiologist, I decide this patient needs this medication, I decide the dose, I draw up the medication, and then I administer the medication. Whereas on the floor, I might say, well, I'm the doctor, I'm gonna write an order, and then the pharmacist is gonna check my order, is going to fill my order, is gonna give it to the nurse, who's going to again double check it, who's then going to administer it. So you've got more steps and layers along the way, whereas that just doesn't exist in the operating room. There was a really nice analysis done in the pediatric anesthesia world, looking at medication administration in the ORs that they did with failure modes effects analysis. And as you can probably imagine, that really ended up focusing solely on frontline administration of medications. And we wanted really to take that bigger look. So we did an STPA of the process. So we started, like with all STPAs, with our accidents and our hazards. And these are reasonably clear and actually easy to apply in medicine, I've found. So hazard is just medication error, and there's a lot of work done in defining medication errors, but essentially we talk about the 4 or 5 rights or wrongs in this case, which would be wrong medication, wrong dose, wrong route, wrong time, and sometimes people add wrong patient. And then these can then be linked to our accidents. In this case, an adverse medication event secondary to a medication error. So adverse medication events may or may not be related to medication errors. So things like if you have an allergic reaction to a medication on your first time getting it, there was no way that you could have prevented that. There was no way you would have known. If though you have anaphylaxis on your second time getting it, when you've had known anaphylaxis in the past, well, now that's an adverse medication event that is secondary to a medication error. So those were what we defined, what we looked at. And our next step was to model our system. So this is what we ended up settling on for how medications are given in the perioperative realm. We went as high as sort of perioperative leadership. So we had pharmacy clinical leadership, surgical clinical leadership, and anesthesia clinical leadership. And we called this sort of tier the perioperative leadership group. These guys pretty much all set protocols, policies, and supplies of medications as their control actions to constrain the actions of this layer below. This layer here is really managing patient care. This is where the cognitive decisions are happening, as well as the communication, coordination of care, those types of piece. So for example, I fit into this box as the anesthesiologist, right? I'm the one who's sitting there saying, okay, this patient needs general anesthesia. They need to be induced with, say, etomidate because their heart is not good enough to tolerate propofol, and I'm making those decisions. And I'm specifying these decisions to whoever is working in the operating room, whether it's in our institution, we have nurse anesthetists, we have resident like trainee physicians, or even if it's me, honestly, in this role too, right? And this is really where the frontline, the execution of patient care occurs, right? So this is where the person in the operating room is focusing on caring for the patient, and they're doing it via control of medications, using infusion pumps, getting information from monitors and ventilators and the electronic health record, the much maligned electronic health record. So this was what we ended up with for a control structure, 7 controllers divided into 3 tiers, and really almost 3 different silos in a way, between the pharmacy, the surgical leadership, and the anesthesia leadership, but all of them interacting. When we went through and identified unsafe control actions and causal scenarios, we managed to find 66 unsafe control actions that we linked to 342 causal scenarios. So we give a lot of examples in our paper to try to help communicate these ideas to people who didn't have the engineering background, but who were solidly grounded in the medicine of it. So this was, we had a chart like this that specified quite a few different ones. But essentially, our control action, one of them was that the anesthesiologist specifies an anesthetic plan. The unsafe control action is that the anesthesiologist specifies an improper anesthetic plan. So one of our causal scenarios for that was the design of the electronic health record makes it difficult to find a critical piece of information that would change the anesthetic management. So this is a true lack of feedback causing an inaccurate mental model. So we even went further from the more generic causal scenarios to very specific concrete examples to try to help communicate these ideas. So one example, and you find this across, I'm sure, every anesthesia department, is that it's difficult to find airway notes, for example, from outside hospitals. So then you might have a patient with a known difficult airway, but you don't know how they were successfully intubated before. And now you might say, well, I think I can put them to sleep and I think I can put in the breathing tube that way, when in reality, they needed to be an awake fiber optic intubation in the past. So missing those key pieces of data can have very real clinical consequences. One thing that we did in our paper that people seemed to really respond to was we actually broke down where we found causal scenarios. And I think that this in particular really helps to highlight the strength of STPA over other types of modeling systems that are used intermittently in the perioperative and in healthcare in general. So here you can see that still 39% of our causal scenarios came from the front lines. And honestly, I think that's pretty easy to explain. If you go back here, we have just so much more detail level at this level than we did at these levels, right? We definitely zoomed in more here. So it's not surprising that that's the bulk of the causal scenarios. What's interesting is that even with the lower level of detail at those higher levels, we got quite a bit of actionable things to really work on out of there, as well as out of this sort of management and decision-making level. So it's nice that with this tool, we could really show that we could go past just, label your syringes better and here's a way to do it. And really get into, you need more incident reporting and more communication from those leadership levels. Things like national shortages of medications have very real consequences for people providing care at the front line. And this model allowed us to really capture some of that. That was my whirlwind tour through an STPA. But just to be mindful of your time, I think I want to move on. And this is something that I've got a couple of my teammates on this webinar learning more about CAST, but we really want to learn from our response during COVID. And I think that we can use CAST to do it. So when COVID surged in Massachusetts, our hospital went from 6 ICUs that were each somewhat specialized, right? A medical ICU, a surgical ICU, a neurosurgical ICU, those sort of things, to having 11 ICUs that all had both COVID patients and a random mix of non-COVID patients. So your former surgical ICU was now seeing, half COVID patients, and the other half were including neuro patients and SICU patients and NICU patients. And then we had 5 of these units were totally new. They had been straight up inpatient floors or post-operative care units, and they were now suddenly working as ICUs. Staff were redeployed into really newly created roles in these ICUs to help care for patients. And clearly a lot went right? We got a lot of patients out of the hospital, but a lot went wrong throughout this process. So we want to know, what can we learn about what went wrong to do better in the predicted second surge? Because we don't think that we're out of the woods yet. And it seems foolish to have these wonderful safety reports that we don't really analyze or learn from. So what our hope is that we have this overarching project of which Leah Tron on this call is leading. And part of it is looking at really structured interviews, qualitative thematic data coding to understand what providers saw in the system, what were their stresses, what were their concerns, to really dig from that data source. But we also have a lot of safety reports, and the question is, how are we going to use them? So I think our goal is to use CAST. CAST is going to provide a good framework for contextualizing these safety reports. Hopefully it's going to really give us a nice visual model that can help people see what the system was. And I think that the model especially is going to be very useful because some of our surge ICUs were very different in structure. And I think if we can even just show those two models side by side with their differences in structure, people are going to immediately be able to grasp, oh, so this one probably had these sorts of problems and this one had different sorts of problems. I think that it's going to be nice to provide that really rigorous approach to pulling data out of these safety reports, because we don't have a lot in there. Some of them are, 2 sentences long, but I think that really putting it into this framework is still going to be able to help us pull out a lot of information. And it's going to be a really different perspective from the thematic coding of these interviews so that we can really help to triangulate the data. So what we're going to be doing is reading through our safety reports to figure out which processes we need to model. We obviously had the operating rooms, but we also had labor and delivery where our anesthesia staff were. We had 2 major surge units, which were very, very different in style, which I think are going to be very interesting to look at side by side. And then we had our standard surgical ICU that took on a slightly different workload. So I think that these are going to give us really interesting insight into the strengths and weaknesses of each type of ICU model and ICU sort of policy to help understand that. We're going to recruit experts in these systems to help us really create the control structure. And then from that control structure, we're going to take a small working group to actually go through the analysis, using those experts as needed as questions come up, which I think is going to hopefully give us a lot of in-depth stuff to think about in COVID, and hopefully on the quicker side, which is why I really appreciated hearing that in Will's experience, this is a much faster approach than other types of modeling systems. So I would love anybody's questions about the STPA that we did, and anybody's thoughts or input on the CAST that we are proposing doing at this time.